Hello, my name is Ryan from Buster Beagle 3D, and today I'm going to do a little tutorial on using xTool Creative Space. If you're familiar with my channel, you may have seen my original tutorials for the xTool D1 a year ago, but much has changed, so it's time for a refresher. This will also be a video where I go over Creative Space for all of the different xTool machines I currently have, which include the D1 Pro, the P2, the F1, and the new S1. When you connect different machines, Creative Space gives you different settings, so first I'll go over the common items and then break this video into separate videos dedicated to each machine, but I just didn't want to go over everything 4 times. So you will see potentially a different machine up here, and the workable area will be a little bit different for the first part of this video, depending on which machine you're watching this. I also wanted to point out that I am not an xTool employee, and this is not an official tutorial. This is neither paid for nor commissioned in any way by xTool. I do receive affiliate commissions on the links in the description, and a special thank you to everyone who has supported my channel by clicking that super thanks button on YouTube. It's always a surprise and definitely not required, but it's always appreciated. With all that said, let's get into it. So again, I'm going to go over some of the more common items. And when you connect your machine, you'll see that there is a little icon of a machine up here in the top right corner. So at least for the first part of this, if you're watching this in the F1 or in the D1 Pro, these might be a little bit different over here, but later on in the video, it'll all be dedicated to your particular machine. So just some general overall usage. We have our workable area right here. If you press these buttons down here, you can zoom in and zoom out of the workable area. You can also press Control on your keyboard and use the middle mouse button to zoom in and out, which is a lot easier to do. If you press Spacebar and drag with the left mouse button, you'll move it side to side. And if you just scroll on the button, it'll go up and down. So that's the general overall usage of how you get around on your screen. You'll also notice with the regular work area, you have multiple canvases down here, or you can have multiple canvases. So if you ever want to do kind of multiple things at the same, or you want to have multiple jobs stacked up in the same project, you can just click on that plus down here and it'll give you another canvas. So let's say I had this on canvas and this on canvas 1. I could essentially set up as many jobs as I want inside of my workable area. So let's say I was creating a box that was taking up more than this workable area, and I wanted to have all of that in the same project, but obviously I can't overlap them because I can't cut them at the same time. I can set up multiple canvases to set all of those up in a single project. Down here we have the select button. So this, when I'm in this mode, I can either select off of a object or I can select onto an object. And then the hand is the same thing as pressing that space bar that I was talking about before, where you just click and move it around. So if you have this little hand up and you can't click on anything, you have to go back to this select button over here, and then you should be able to click on things, and then you can move those things around. So up here in the top left corner is the settings. So these are the settings not for your particular machine, but for xTool Creative Space. Now the only things that I really use in here is the unit of scale. So right now I have it set to millimeters, and it's set to millimeters by default. Even though I'm in the US, I highly recommend, if you do anything on laser engravers or 3D printers, I do all of my stuff in millimeters, so it's just far easier. But you can change that to inches if you would like. Right under that is a hotkey, so you can click on View, and this will open up the different hotkeys that you can use inside of Creative Space. It's set up for Windows and for a Mac, so if you want to work a little bit faster, you can figure out all those hotkeys here. And the only other thing that I really do inside of here is check for updates. So if you want to see if there is a newer version of Creative Space, and they seem to be coming out with quite a few versions, so this is a good place to check and see that you have the most updated version of the software. So right next to that is the files. So we can either create a new project, We can open a project, which is opening up a .xcs file, which is the Creative Space file format. We can import an image, which is the same thing as importing an image from here, which I'll go over in just a second. I can save as, where I save it as a new name, or I can export an SVG. So if I have a vector graphic in here and I want to open it up in Illustrator, or I want to open it up in Inkscape, I can now export an SVG out of here so that I can open it up in another program, which you used to not be able to do, which is kind of nice that you have that option now. Next to that is a login for cloud. So this is where you can save your projects on the cloud so that you can access them in different places. This is also where you can sign up for xTool projects if you want to contribute to that entire community. This is where you would log in for that. You can also log in over here on the right-hand side. So that's kind of in two spots. So for that xTool projects, when you click on that, this is kind of a community that xTool has set up. It's kind of neat, especially for beginners, to be able to see different designs that people have worked on. You can come in here and you can select your specific machine that you're working on. So let's say you were working on the D1 Pro, and then it'll only show you projects that were specifically made with a D1 Pro. Now, some of these are projects that you can download and work on, and then some of them are just inspirational files. So for instance, this one, if I click on it, these are just members. Some are put on here by the company. So you can come in here and you can kind of see that the settings that they were working with, and you can open that in XCS, or you can download it for later. But this is a good way, especially for beginners, of kind of getting your feet wet and figuring out how to work on some projects with the machine and get you up and running really, really quickly. Now, like I was saying, there's some in here that are really just more, if it says file, you can download it. If it says inspiration, let me see if, okay, so like this one is a how-to for how to do this tumbler. And like this one just says inspiration. So this one will kind of tell you what they did, but this one doesn't give you a file. I've also seen things in here where there are Lightburn files only in here, which is kind of odd, but it's kind of a grab bag of a lot of different things, but it's constantly getting updated and expanded. So there's a couple cool things that you can find in here. Again, this is really good for beginners to kind of get your feet wet. Next to that is the announcements. So this could have announcements that xTool is coming out with. This also kind of tells you what is new in the latest version of xTool Creative Space, or what has changed since the last time. This thing will pop up when a new version comes up as well. So you can kind of go through the release notes of what's changed. And it seems like they're updating things quite frequently. So it's really cool to see what has been different. Next to that is a support page. So that will open up the xTool support page, which you can browse again by your product. So I'll click on the S1, and there's troubleshooting guides, getting started guides, maintenance on what you can do. So there's a lot of really good information in here if you get stuck on anything. So that is a good resource to have right there. Right next to that is the shop, which will just take you to the website. I don't need to click on it. It'll just take you to the xTool website. And I already showed you guys, this is your profile if you decide to sign up for one. Now, you don't have to sign up for one to use any of the stuff here in Creative Space. But if you want kind of some of those added features, or if you wanted to contribute to this xTool projects thing, you would have to sign up for an account. Okay, so now I'm going to go over the left-hand side here. So the first thing that we have here is image. So again, you can click on image, or you can go to import image. And when we're talking about images, there's really two types of images that we're working with. One is what is called a raster image. And so that would be a photograph. And so what I'm going to grab is this Eiffel Tower image that I took. So this window will pop up, obviously, if the image is too large for whatever your particular canvas is. Sometimes I like to tell it to display it in its original size if I'm going to be doing editing, because it just comes in larger. But for right now, I'll just say scale to fit on canvas. So again, this is the first type of image, and this is what is called a raster image. So that's any type of photograph, anything that's not a line drawing. So really the differentiation that you're making here is the only thing you can really do with an image is you can engrave. So you'll notice when I have it selected, the only processing type I have over here, and again, this is for the S1, but it'll be kind of the same thing for the other machines, but you only can engrave with an image. If you have something like a vector graphic, which is this line art, you'll see that I have score, engrave, and cut. So the only thing that you can do with a raster is engrave, and then with the vector image, you can do all of the things. So if I was to hit engrave, it would fill in this shape. If you hit score, it'll just go around the object, kind of draw an outline around it. And then cut is where you kind of slow the speed down and you would cut this out of something. But I'm going to go back to this raster image. So they give you a couple different filters that you can use. So this is just the original image. And also if it's too large, you can just select one of the corners, click and then drag, and you can make it smaller. I'll kind of go over that when I go into the size of the things over here later. They have a couple different kind of filters that you can put on a bitmap image or a raster image. So we can add a grid. So it kind of puts it as a grid pattern. This is kind of similar to the dithering that I'll talk about later on, but this is kind of just a one-step dither. We can go into sketch mode. So some of these are very similar to things that you would see in Photoshop. So we have a couple different comics and sketches. We can emboss the image and then just set it to black and white. And then with a lot of these different settings, we have a sharpness. So if I go to this black and white, I'm going to zoom in. Depending on which one that you're using, the sharpness will change different settings. You can also play with this grayscale. So if you move from the top down, it'll take the darker sections out. And if you do it from the bottom up, it will take the lighter sections out. So you might want to play with some of that when you are messing with an image. You can also invert the image. So a lot of times when you see people engraving on those kind of metal business cards, a lot of times what you will do is invert the image. It would engrave away all the black sections, and everything that's white here would be left. So that would be the black section that you would see on the business card. I can also go into edit image. So when I come in here, I have three editing options. I have this magic wand, which I can click on objects and it'll basically select them and delete them. I'm doing Control Z to undo. Now this fuzziness value down here is kind of the threshold that it can select at. So if I was to turn this way down and select something, you see it's only able to select a small section because it's looking for things that are the same value as what I just selected. So if the fuzzy value was really high and it clicks on it, it's going to take away a much larger section. And then next to that is an eraser. So the eraser has a size that I can move by putting in a value or by moving this slider here, and that'll just erase away portions of my image. And then finally we have a crop. So if I only wanted a certain section, I can just click, drag around a section, click OK, and then I have just a smaller section of this image. And then once I'm done, I just hit save, and now I have a crop version of that file. Now, if I go back into that file, it's already cropped, so you want to make sure that you meant to do that instead of something that you didn't want to do. If I want to crop this or mask it with a shape, come over here and grab a shape, and I'm just going to place it over my object. Now, with this shape selected, I can shift select the image and then right click, and then I can click here. It says make clipping mask. And then I can move the background object if I would like to. I can scale it. I can do whatever I want to it. And then I just have to click done up here. And then now I have an outline or a mask of that image. Now, this is also editable, so it's not final. So if I double click on it, you'll see that I can have the image back, and I can either select the front shape and move that around, or I can select the back shape or a back image and move that around. And then when I'm done, just hit done again. So this is just another way of creating a mask or somewhat of a cropping of the image that you're working on. So if I was to select a rectangle, and then that's what I was using for the cropping, then it would be different than coming in here and doing an edit image, where this crop in here is final, whereas the crop in here is non-destructive. So you can change the image or move the crop if you want to deal with that later. And I'll show you later on how to crop an image non-destructively a little bit later. Okay. So under that, we have trace image. And for that, I'm going to actually open up a different file. So this is the Buster Beagle logo, which is too large. I'm going to scale it down. Okay. So now for this image, when I click on trace image, what it's going to do is it's going to use kind of that fuzziness, kind of a denoising based on how detailed your image is. This works really well with a black and white image. You can also do layering by color if you want to, where it'll give you multiple layers. But for right now, all I want it to do is kind of give me a vector outline of this image. So I can just click on save. And then if I was to move it over to the side, you'll see that instead of a raster image, I now have a vector image. So while I could only engrave this because it's like a photograph or a picture, this one, I could go in and I could do a cutting, or I could do an engraving where it'll engrave everything that is blue. So there might be, certain instances where you want to turn your raster image into a vector image, which is the next thing that I'm going to talk about right now. So again, you can either open up these images, these are all just JPEGs, and this one's a PNG, or you can open up an SVG. So you can open up SVGs and DXFs, and these are basically line drawings that you get out of something like Adobe Illustrator, or you can even export these out of Lightburn and bring them into here if you chose to. So for right now, I'm just going to open this up. And so when it opens up this image, you'll see that each one of these, as I kind of scroll over it, is line data. So each one of these could be selected and moved individually. And if I was to select just a certain part, I can engrave that, I can cut it, I can score it, I can do anything that I want to this particular one. But those are the two kind of different ways that you can bring images into this program. And I'll go over some other settings that have to do with this a little bit later on when I'm talking through this toolbar here. But just know that those are the two types that you can bring in. And I'm just going to select and delete that for now. So under that, we have insert. So we can insert a line, a rectangle, or a circle. It's all pretty self-explanatory. If you select it and hit shift, it will do it evenly, like it'll do it at a shape. Same thing with a circle. So you can just select and drag, but if you were to hit shift, then it'll do it at a proportionate scale. And same thing with lines. So if you click on a line, and then even if you're moving it around, you hit shift, it'll do it in 90-degree increments. So you can place these down if you would like. Next to that is shape. And so there's just a bunch of different shapes that they give you. I'm not going to obviously go through all of these, but, just like you were inserting a rectangle or a circle, there's other things that you can insert. So you can just insert a heart and move that around. And now again, this is what is called a vector shape. So you can engrave, you can cut it, you can score, which is just to do an outline around it. And that's pretty simple. Under that, we obviously have text. You can add texts. And then over here in the window, you can change that to whatever you want. You can change the size. You can go through the different typefaces. This should be for any of the fonts that you currently have on your machine, plus whatever ones came with xTool Creative Space. There's different styles for different fonts. The spacing will change out the spacing between the letters. So all this is pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, we have the lines. You can also weld these so that they're no longer text files anymore. So once they're welded, they're just regular vector graphics. There's no editing that you can do to that. I'm going to undo that. And then if you can kind of see here, it's a little bit hidden, but this is for creating shapes. So if you select this and then you drag it down, you can kind of start to curve it around objects, depending on where you move this either to the side. You can kind of change how strong it does something like that. Now, as of this video, I don't know of any way of kind of drawing out a path or a shape and attaching this data to that. I'm not sure if that's possible in this program or not. If you do know how to do that, please let me know in the comment. But this is essentially how you add text to something. Okay, so next I have this vector shape. And so I can click on this and I can start just clicking on points to make my own shape. And if I end on the first point again, it'll create a closed shape that I can, engrave, I can cut, I can score. Now, if you want to not have just sharp edges here, you can double click on it. And if you double click on the point, you'll get this little Bezier curve where you can turn this into a rounded corner. So any one of these can become a rounded corner, or you double click again to go back to a sharp corner. So that way you can get kind of like, linear shapes, but you can also do nice smooth shapes as well. Now, xTool also has this XArt, which is something that you have to log in for, but it's essentially like Midjourney or something like that, where you can use text to create different pieces of art. I haven't used this myself. There are different ways that you can earn points. So like if you add something to the xTool projects, or if you enter in a contest, there's different ways that you can get points from xTool that you can then use as currency to be able to make some of these AI creations. So if that's something that interests you, that is in there. And then the last thing here is a QR code or a barcode. So if you click that, you can just enter in a website, busterbeagle3d.com, hit save, and it'll give you a QR code that you can then burn onto your product. You can do the same thing for barcodes. It'll just, if you can enter in letters, numbers, and it'll give you a barcode for that. So it's just kind of a nice little tool that allows you to customize some of your projects. And that's kind of everything down the side. Okay, so now going across the top here for this menu window, we have our undo and redo. So I'm just going to draw a shape out so that those show up. I can copy and paste just like you paste in another program with Control-C, Control-V. Let's see, I undo, I can go back and I can redo, moving in that. So if I select this and then I click on outline, you can see what that does is it creates an outline around the object that you have selected. This will work with vector images. It'll also work with raster images that I'll show in just a second, but you can just kind of move this. If you go into the negative, it'll go inside of an object. If you go to the positive, it'll go to the outside of the object. If I was to bring in that Buster, so if I was to do that on this image and click on outline, it's going to add it to the outside because this particular image has this white space filled in. Now, if I was to go back here and I was to select that and go to Edit Image. Now, if I was to take out that white area, so now this is an alpha, and hit Save, and then come and do the outline, you'll see that it'll start to do an outline of the inside and of the outside. So if I wanted to, make a sticker, or let's say I wanted to engrave my Buster image, but then I wanted to cut around him, but do a little buffer between where I engraved and where I cut, this is where you would do something similar to that. So if I wanted to do something like that, let me undo. I'm going to go back to Edit Image. I'm going to remove this outer ring, and then I'm going to clear that little ring I have there, hit Save. And so now if I was to do outline, you can see that I could create stickers, I could create all kinds of things by being able to create an outline around that object. So that's what that is for, okay? All right, so next to that is array. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a little rectangle here. So if I click on Grid Array, it will give me the number of columns and rows based on the parameters I have in here. Now, one kind of weird thing that I'd love to see the devs do is have this window movable so I can see what I'm working on. So when you're working on something like this, you kind of have to move this off to the side, select it, and then you click Grid Array. And so I can kind of see what's going on up here. But, pretty self-explanatory. You change the number in the grid, and it'll give you duplicates of your original box. You can also change the spacing between the two. So yeah, that's pretty simple. Hit OK. Select and delete these. You can also do a circular array, and this one will essentially do exactly what it's saying. It'll give you all of this stuff in a circle. So if you click on the Y, so anything up and down is Y, left to right is X. So if I change this to 100 and hit OK and zoom out, you'll see that it's kind of created a little bit of a clock here where it went around in a circle array. So that's all that does. Okay. But the really cool feature that they've added here is the last option in the array, and that's the material test array. So whenever you hear someone saying that you have to do a power speed test on something that you're working on, this is where you can set up one for yourself. So if you have an object here, and then I would say material test array, you'll see here that it makes a little grid for you based on the parameters in here that you can then use to test the laser on your particular objects to see what the proper burning speed and power is. And again, this will change a little bit based on the machine that you have listed here. So right now I have the S1, so this is giving me a power speed test for the S1. And again, I can change whether I want the max power to only go up to 50, or if I wanted the max speed to only go up to 200. So there are different things that you can change in here. And then once you're done, you can go in here and move some of these things by clicking on this either group or ungroup. And so at this point, I'm going to skip over the section right here that says Smart Fill. That's only for the machines that have cameras in them. So I'll go over here to the group and ungroup and kind of talk with this grid. So if you were to go into here and you wanted to, change what this says or move it around, you can come over here and you can click on ungroup, because right now this whole thing has been created as a group. So if I click ungroup, then I can come in here and select the specific pieces of it. And you'll see here where this is 200 millimeters per second speed and 10% power. So if you click on it, you come over here and you see that this is 10% power and 200 millimeters per second speed. I could come in here, I could get rid of this text if I didn't want to see it, or I could alter it. And then I can always go back in here and group it again. And then instead of each piece being individually selectable, I can select the whole thing and move it. Okay. Now, another cool thing that this array does, so let's say I had this Eiffel Tower back again. So I'm going to scale this down really small. And again, this might not be the best image for this, but it's just to kind of explain it. So I can click on a raster image, I can go into that array, and then I can do material test arrays. And then in this way, you can kind of go in and not only just see what a regular black dot will do, but you can come in here and change the parameters of what you want for an image. So in here, if I was to ungroup this, you could even come in here and change the bitmap mode that it's being used per image. So let's say I wanted to do something where this was all using like a Jarvis, and then the next one was using a Stuckey or an Atkinson. All of those can be changed inside of here. You can also select all of those at the same time and change those to something else. So anyway, there's just a lot of things that you can do to be able to run tests, because you can go online, you can find material speeds for a lot of things, but really the best way to do it is to test it on your own pieces, because that's really going to be the only way that you know exactly how your machine in your environment on your particular materials is really going to work. So it's really nice that they now have this built in, so you can specifically make a grid just for you and for what you want to do. Okay, so the next thing is the aligns. So I'm just going to draw out a couple of shapes here real quick. So if I was to select all of these and go to the align tool, there's just obviously a bunch of different things that we can do here. This is pretty standard across a lot of software. We can align it to the right. One cool thing that I like to do a lot when I'm messing with things is, let's say I want to have this box halfway between these two boxes. I can select all of those, and then you can do a distribute vertically, which will put it halfway between those two. So there's just a lot of different things that you can do with the align tools. So when it comes to this arrange, say I had this burn logo, so I'll bring this one in. All right, so let's say I have this image, and I'm going to take off the backdrop, save. And let's say I had my Eiffel Tower. So right now the Eiffel Tower is in front of the Buster Beagle 3D logo, but let's say I wanted that the other way around. I could select this, click on Arrange, bring to the front, and then now it's over the image. So this is just a way of figuring out the layering of the orientation of your images. So next to that, we have the combine. So let's say I have two rectangles here. All right, so if I select these two rectangles and I click on Combine Unite, it will combine. So wherever it was overlapping, it'll now be a combined or single object. If I select both of those and do subtract, it will take off the second item from the first one. So if I select this one first and then select this one second and then go to subtract, it's subtracting the second item. If I do it the other way, it'll subtract the other one. After that, we have the united overlap. So where the two pieces overlap, that is your new shape. And then the last one is subtracted overlap. Now, you might not notice anything, but if I was to select this and go into engrave, you'll see that this section in the middle is no longer filled anymore. So it's only going to fill on the outside. Now, this really comes into play when you're grabbing an SVG from another place. So again, I have this SVG of a cutting board, and right now, every single one of these things is a separate piece. So even if I was to take all of this and group it, if I was to click on here and hit engrave, you'll see that there's still sections here where pieces are overlapping, where that doesn't really work well. So if I come in here and instead of, I'm just going to ungroup this for now. If I come in here and instead of saying group, I go to combine and subtract at overlap, what that's going to do, it's going to go through this whole thing, and depending on how intricate your SVG is, it might take a second, but it's going to go through and you see that it smartly subtracted the shapes that were inside of other shapes. So now this is a much more cohesive piece that I don't have to go in and do anything to. I can either go in and I can score around these pieces, or I can engrave, which will only fill in these sections, or cut. So if you ever bring in an SVG or any type of vector file where things are kind of overlapping and you go to hit, and this is what you get, this is why you're getting that. So that combine and subtracted overlap is how you fix that. And then if for whatever reason you want to mirror the object, you can reflect it horizontally or reflect it vertically. So now with xTool Creative Space, you can use absolute coordinates, so you can kind of know exactly where a piece is going to burn on your machine. And if you've been following my channel, you'll know that I like to use absolute coordinates with every machine that I can. So even on this S1, I burned a grid onto the metal base plate of my machine so that if I want to know exactly where something is going to engrave on, I can just move this to the place where that is going to engrave. And that's kind of what you can do up here with this position button. So whatever you put in here, currently, until they give you a way to position other points, is going to be this top left corner. So this top left corner right now is currently at X 238.5. So X is the sideways motion, and then Y is from up and down. And so 0 is in this top left corner over here. So that would be over 238 and down 108. So if I was to change this to 200, and I was to change this to 100, that means that this point right here is exactly at 100, which you can kind of see here. It might be a little bit hard to see through YouTube, or 200 right here. So that's exactly where that image is. And then over here we have size. So right now this is a width of 170 millimeters. Again, I do all of my work in millimeters, and it is 150 high. So if I was to change this to 100, so now it's 100 high, and because this is locked right here, it will scale this proportionately. Now, if I didn't want to scale proportionally, I can just click on that lock, and then I can move this, and then this number will change while this one stays the same. Or again, I can move it like here if I want to squash it. But you can only do that if this is unlocked. And again, you'll notice that things will only work when you have them selected. So you can change your settings when something is selected. You can change any of these other tools up here when something is selected. So the next thing would be a rotate. So I can rotate this 90 degrees. And when you rotate, it rotates from the center. It's not rotating from the position up here. It's always going to rotate from the center. So just keep that in mind. Even if you were to select this point up here, which is also a rotate, it will always rotate from the center of your image. And then the last thing over here is corner radius. So let's say I drew out a rectangle, and then over here I can change the corner radius, which will add a little bit of a fillet to the end, so that if I wanted a rounded box, I could get that versus a square one. And so that's what this corner radius does over here. So now the last thing that I want to get into before I get into the specifics for each individual machine is the Layers tab. Now, this is something that's fairly new to Creative Space, which is very exciting that they've added it in here. So depending on what I want to do, I might want to have things in different layers so that I can hide things. So let's say I create a rectangle that goes around this, and then let's say I also have an image in here. Scale that down. Now I'm just moving this with arrow keys, which is another way that you can move things around rather than dragging. Now let's say on this one, right now everything is in the same layer, but let's say that I don't want to output this section here, but I still want it to be displayed in this image or in my canvas here. So what I can do is create a new layer and add that to a new layer. So if I just click on it, if I right click, here you'll see that you can copy, cut, paste, delete, but you could also move it to another layer. So right now I have layer 1, which is this black. So I could just say red. It'll create another layer over here. And if I wanted to hide that layer, they just added this eye, so I can either look at a layer or not look at a layer. Now, one thing to keep in mind with layers, and which is something that is a little bit different than this works in Lightburn, is when you're dealing with layers in Lightburn, everything inside of that layer will have the same parameters, but that's not really the way that it works in here. So as you can see here, I have a vector image and I have a raster image. So those are two different things that this one can score, engrave, and cut, and this one could only ever engrave. But I could have them in the same layer. Don't think of layers as, hey, anything in this layer is going to receive the same parameters. It's more of just a way of setting up your scene so that it's more organized. And you can also not have something display or not have something go and be part of the job. So even if it's hidden in here, it's still being output. So if I was to go over to this process tab, you'll see that it's still showing up in what is going to burn onto whatever I'm burning onto. So hiding it does not remove it. It just makes it easier for you to see what's happening. But what would remove it is over here where it says output. So output means send it to the laser or ignore. And if I click on ignore and then go to process, even though it was still visible, it won't show up in my engraving. So that's just kind of a nice way of being able to, kind of break this up into separate pieces and pieces that are more manageable. Because once you start to have things kind of overlapping, it might be hard to choose a certain thing without selecting something else. So putting things in layers to make it more organized is really what those are for. Now, there's another thing that I'll talk about in a little bit, and it's called the processing path. So you'll see auto planning. And so what auto planning will do is it'll burn all of the engraving first, and then it'll burn the cutting. But if you want it to be specific about what it does and the order in which it does something, you can set up a bunch of different layers. So let's say I wanted this to cut out very last. I could click and I could move that to its own layer. Right now, anything at the top is what it does first, so I can even select that and drag it all the way to the bottom. So this would go first, this would go second, and this would go third. I can move it to the bottom here. And then if I was over here and instead of the processing path of auto planning, I could click on by layer, and it'll just burn this section first, it'll do this section next, and it'll do this last. So there might be some instances where you want to pick the order in which it does something, where you want it to cut out a section that's on the inside first before it cuts the section that's on the outside or something like that. So that might be why you want to set that to by layer, but by default, it'll just engrave first and then cut second. But it's really nice that they added this entire layer system. But again, it's more for kind of planning rather than settings. So just don't think that because you put something in a particular layer, it's going to have the same settings, because it won't. You can also select things and move them to other layers. So right now, this is in layer 2, which I can also name. So I'm going to name this Buster. And if I wanted to move that to another layer, I can select it inside of here, and I could say move to, these aren't labeled, but you can see the color. Let's say I want to move that to layer 1. I can move that to layer 1, and now it'll hide with it. So that's kind of the layers in a nutshell. You can also make this smaller if you want to get it out of the way, and that's it. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the more specific settings that you get with your particular machine. So right now, this is the xTool S1, and up in the top right corner, you should see an image of the machine that you are working with. Right now, you can see that I'm connected through Wi-Fi. Now, this first little icon up here right above the machine, now this is supposed to take you to the product support page of your particular machine. Now, at the time that I'm making this video, this link does not work for the S1 because it's so new. So this doesn't take you anywhere except a page saying that I don't have permission. But when you're watching this video, hopefully that has been corrected, and this should take you to the product support page for the S1. Right next to that is an icon, so it'll tell you which machine you're using. If you have multiple xTool machines, you can switch the devices here with multiple different ways of hooking up your machine. Now also, when you first hook up your machine, you need to be using the USB for the initial setup. You can then go into the Wi-Fi and hook things up using the Wi-Fi. But for the initial setup, you're going to be using the USB. Okay, back to the basic info. We can check for updates, which should let us know whether there is any new firmware for this machine. It looks like I'm on the latest one currently. This is where you do your setup for the Wi-Fi. Again, I had such an early version of this machine that this wasn't working correctly when I first set everything up. I ended up having to set up the Wi-Fi for the S1 through the mobile app. So there is an xTool Creative Space mobile app, which did allow me to hook up the machine to my Wi-Fi. So hopefully that also is corrected by the time that you are watching this, but this is where you would set up your Wi-Fi. If you want to export parts of your design as G-code that can be read by other machines, this is where you would do that. There is also an adjustment for the flame alarm. So depending on if you're kind of getting some false positives on how intense the machine thinks that the flame is in your machine, you can turn the sensitivity higher or lower. Stops when moved is the tilt sensor. So, if you have a particularly not stable work surface area, you might want to turn that off because it has some gyroscopes in there that might think that your machine is getting bumped. The fill light brightness, this is how bright the interior LED lights are in your S1. And then down here, this auto adjustment for the air assist. So you can pick the strength that you want for the air assist while it's doing the cutting or engraving. So what this is doing is it's turning it on full power whenever I'm cutting with the S1, but you'll see that here, even with engraving, it still has the power to 1. And the reason for that is really, you never really want to turn the air assist completely off because you don't want any smoke or soot or debris to kind of go inside of the nozzle. So that's why it's usually a good idea to have at least a little bit of a trickle of air even when you're engraving, and then put the machine in full power of the air assist when cutting. The buzzer reminders just kind of turns this buzzer on and off when you're doing particular things with the machine. For conveyor feeder, this is just saying once it's pushed the entire piece through, after it's done, it'll bring it back to the starting point. So that's what that little thing is there. And that's really all you need on this page. So right under the image of the machine that you have, there's another drop down here, and you'll see that it has laser flat, laser cylindrical, curve process, and conveyor feeder. So these are all the different modes that you can use with the S1, and they're pretty self-explanatory. Laser flat is just your everyday engraving with the laser. It's what you're going to use most of the time when you first get the machine. Laser cylindrical is a setup for the rotary. So if you're using the RA2 Pro and you want the settings for that, this would be the one that you choose. Curve process is a 3D engraving that happens with the S1, and I'll kind of go over how to set that up. And then finally, the conveyor feeder, where you would be using this with the lifting platform that you can buy separately for the machine, as well as the conveyor. And this should be able to push a board or whatever else it is you want to engrave on or cut on up to 10 feet. So that's where you would choose that. And you'll notice that when you choose these different things, you'll see that some of the parameters down here change along with it. So I'll be going through those right now. So the first we have is laser flat. And with the material here, you can set a user-defined material. So if you click on this, you'll see that it has a few items in here that they've specifically give you cut speeds and power for different types of materials. Now, it's not an extensive list right now, especially because this machine is new and they need to populate this list. You can even click on more in here and it'll show you these items. Now, if you click off of supported, you'll see that there's a lot, more things in here that they have listed that they're going to try to support, I'm sure, in the future when they release all of these values. But there also is on the xTool website. If you come into the website and then you go to support, and then there's material settings here, there's a lot of different material settings that are already kind of set up here. Again, because this is such a new machine at the time that I'm making this video, a lot of this hasn't been fleshed out yet, but you'll see that there are different settings for different materials on the different machines. So hopefully this will get updated soon with the xTool S1 parameters as well. And again, these are really just kind of a starting point. Your wood could be different, your environment could be different. So you really want to run some of those power speed tests that I was talking about before when I showed the array. But this should give you a general idea of where to start with some of this. Also, just getting into that, there's also a wealth of knowledge on the Facebook groups for xTool. So if you would like, I highly recommend joining some of the xTool Facebook groups. There's official ones, there's unofficial ones, and you can kind of see some of the power and speed settings that other people have used for their items. And so that, again, it's always a good starting point, but your material might be different, your environment might be different. So, use it as a starting point, but, you really need to find the settings that work best for you. Okay, so I'm going to leave that blank for right now. If I was to choose something, like, let's say I was doing 3mm black acrylic, and let me just drop in that image real quick. Okay, you'll notice that when I select this image, it already has some of the power and speeds based on that reference. Now, it'll show you this window when I have this image selected. If I was to click off of this image, it goes back to that original menu that we were just looking at right now. So it really depends on what you have selected, what you're going to see. So for right now, I'm just going to say user defined material, where I'm going to put in my own values. So the next thing here is distance. Now, for the S1, it has something to auto measure the distance, and I highly recommend doing that if possible. So you just need to physically move the laser head over whatever it is that you're engraving or cutting on, and then you'll press this little button next to it, and it should drop down the laser head and measure that object. So I'm going to do that right now. So I'm just moving it, and as you can see that red crosshair moves along with it. And so that red crosshair is telling you where exactly the machine is going to probe when it tries to do the measurements. And then I will click measure. And so right now the machine is dropping. Then you should be able to probe the distance. Now, this distance in here is not the thickness of the piece. So you can't just place the thickness of the piece in there. Actually, what it is the distance from the top of your laser module head to your piece minus 100. And so that's how you would manually calculate that figure. But for the most part, I haven't had to do that, and just using that probe is fine. Now, after that is the thing that we talked about a little bit before, which is the processing path. And this is saying whether I wanted to just do auto planning, which will do any engraving first, and then it'll do any cutting processes. You can also pick by layer, and then it'll just run through all of your layers. If you have multiple layers, it'll just run from the top to the bottom, cutting or engraving in the order in which you have set up your lasers. So that's what that path does. All right, so now with the S1, we're going to talk about this laser module position system. And what this does is this is setting up where you can essentially tell your laser where the object is that you are engraving on. So what you want to do is click on Start Marking. And then here, the way that this works is there's a 2-point position system. So you're going to tell the laser where the top left corner is, and then you're going to tell the laser where the bottom right corner is of the object that you're engraving on. So what you do is you just physically move the laser to the top right corner, so where the crosshairs of the laser that you can see is on the top left, and then you're going to press the button on the front of the laser, which should give you the first positioning point. And then you're going to move it all the way to the bottom right, and that should give you the second positioning point. So after that, you can just hit Done. And what you should have is an outline of the object that you're wanting to engrave or cut on shown right in the viewer. So I know that the piece that I just measured starts up here and it ends down here. So whatever I'm working with, now I can kind of position it where I want it on that piece. Now, if you saw my video where I go over the review of this machine, the one thing that I felt was kind of lacking a little bit with this particular system is I can't really tell that the object that I had in there was 100% square to the laser. So in that case, you know, if this was slightly askewed, or if the whole thing was turned 5 degrees or 2 degrees, I might not be exactly straight to my laser, because there's really no way of knowing 100% that I've aligned it to be square with the laser. So what I had done for this was generate a grid that I burned directly onto the metal base plate of the laser. And so this way, instead of doing this kind of 2-point position process, what I did instead was I burned a grid that corresponds to the absolute coordinates of this machine. And so that way I know that I can square things up. And then if I'm placing things in here, again, this top left corner is this position, so I can basically set that position to align somewhere with my grid. And I'll show you guys. And so this is what that grid looks like. And so this would correspond exactly to what I have burned onto that base plate of my grid. I could put it in the same layer, ignore it, and then if I ever wanted to use this to align whatever it is that I'm working with, I can do that really easily. You can also pretty much just zoom in here and you'll see up here, I don't know if this is coming through on YouTube, but it says 240 at the top here, and that corresponds exactly to my X, which is 240 right here, and then 150, which you can see on the side here. So if you're interested in this grid, I do have it on Etsy, and I'll have it in the video description if that's something that you are interested in. And then this laser module position is just showing you where that laser pointer is at this time. So if you don't want to see that, you can just turn it off here or on. And so let's say you have marked your position of where things are. I'm going to do that again real quick. Done. So with this outline here, you remove it, and you can remove it by just clicking on the little trash can icon next to start marking. When you click framing, it'll say to press the button on the front of the machine. And when it does that, it'll just frame the object for me when I press that button. And then when I'm done, I can either press the button again if I want to see it again, or just say framing complete. Now, another thing that you can do is click on these 3 little dots down here next to it. So when you come in here, you can change the framing speed, so how fast that framing operation that we just did will work. You can also change the X and Y speed. This will be of moving the laser head manually. You can also change how far you want that to move with each one of these button pushes. And you can also change how far you want the Z distance, or how far the laser head will move up or down. And when you press any of these, you can see that this dot inside of here is moving, and that is also because the laser head itself is moving inside of the machine. Now, the center of both the Z and the XY is the home position. So if I click on that, that will move my laser all the way back to the original home position of the machine. Same thing for the Z. If that was down or if it was up, if you just press this, it will reset the home position of that particular thing. So now I know we were talking about this a little bit when we were going over the difference in images earlier in this video, but right now I'm going to go more into the settings that you have for both a raster and a vector image per machine, because it is slightly different whether you're using the S1 versus the F1. So just based on whichever machine you're using, there are slight differences. So I'm going to select this image. All of this stuff is the same. And then in here, we have the engraving section. Above that is, again, whether we want this layer to output or ignore. So output will burn, ignore will not burn. Again, we only have the engrave option because this is a raster image or just a regular image. It's not vector line art like the other one. This is set to manual right now because when we were over here, we just say user defined material because we didn't pick any already set up materials. So this is where we change the power percentage, so how strong we want it to burn on our material. And again, we can get some of those settings from the website or doing our own power speed tests. Under that is millimeters per second of how fast this can go. 600 millimeters per second is the top speed that it could possibly go. Now, that doesn't mean that you can engrave at that. That is based on your material and based on what you're doing, that is the fastest you can actually get the machine to run. And then how many passes we want to do on that model. So the passes would be, how many times you want whatever the process that you're running. So if you're cutting, sometimes you want multiple passes. I don't usually do multiple passes when I'm doing engraving, but there might be some instances where you want to do that. So this is where you would set that. And then bitmap mode. This is really setting up the different types of dithering methods that you're working with. Now, unfortunately, xTool doesn't really show you in here what the dithering methods will do. So let's say I have this set to grayscale. So what grayscale is going to do is it's just going to move and it's going to burn from the top all the way to the bottom. And the value that it's going to try to pick up is if it's a dark area, the laser is going to be stronger. If it's a light area, the laser is going to be not as strong. And so that's kind of what the whole grayscale will do, is it'll just go line by line by line. And based on how dark the pixel is that it's trying to emulate, it'll just change the power setting of the laser. And you can kind of see it if I was to click on process here and I zoom in, you'll see that it's really just a black and white image. And if I really zoom in, you can kind of see these lines here. So each one of these pixels on this line is a different strength that the laser is trying to burn at to make this image. So probably an easier and simpler way to kind of understand this is with this image of a gradient that I have here. So when I have that gradient selected and then I have grayscale process, you'll see here that even if I zoom in, I'll see different shades for all of these different squares, all the way from about 10% gray all the way up to 90% gray. And so when the laser is going from left to right, the power that it's using while it's burning this will be very low when it's, more towards the white, and it'll be very high when it's towards the darker blacks on the other side. Now, the other versions here underneath grayscale are what are called dithering methods. So instead of just changing the laser power, all of these underneath here are really just going to change the way that it shades with black dots. So it's very similar to the way that this grid works here in the bitmap image filters. So if I zoom into here, you'll see that when I'm in the very light areas over on the left here, there's no dots at all because there's nothing for it to shade. And then the further and further I get towards the dark black, they become almost completely filled in because they're trying to fill in that area with a cluster of dots to make it fill in. So that's really what these other modes underneath here are doing. So if I go back to the original and I click on something like Jarvis and then I click Process, you'll see that, again, when I'm over to the left here, there are fewer dots. And then when I go all the way over to where the black is, all of the dots are so close together that it's completely filling it in and making it black. So all of these different methods under here are just different algorithms that are used to do the same thing. There'll be dots, and depending on how close they are and how many of them there are, these will all be different, somewhat patterns of creating the images. And then under that would be the lines per centimeter. So what that is saying is per each centimeter of image that you're working with, how many lines do you want to go back and forth? Now, there is a little bit of a science to this number here, and really it's based on the spot size of the laser. And that's why when you hear people talking about, if you have a 5-watt laser, you can get better detail than if you have a 40-watt laser. And that all has to do with the spot size. So think of it as, using a Sharpie marker. And if you're using the fine tip Sharpie marker, you can get much better detail than if you're using one of the more blunt tip Sharpie markers. And that's really the difference here. So it's really the resolution that you're able to achieve based on the laser head that you have. And I believe with the 40-watt laser, the highest line per centimeter that you can get is 100 lines per centimeter. Because if you go any higher than that, then when the laser head starts going, line by line, the laser head might be burning so large that it's burning into the layers next to it. So think of it as like dots per inch. They put it in lines per centimeter. And then under that would be an engraving mode, and it's set to bidirectional or unidirectional. And really that just means when the laser goes to one side, it's burning the whole way when it goes to the right. And if I want it to burn on the way back, I can just keep it at bidirectional. Or if you only ever wanted it to burn from left to right, then you can set that to unidirectional. But just keep in mind that that's going to take twice as long because the laser would have to go all the way, burn, and then stop burning, and then come all the way back to the the start point and then burn again for the next layer. So I don't think that I've ever really turned on this unidirectional. Okay, so that's the basic settings for an image. Now, if I had a vector shape, so I'm just going to put this simple star in here, you'll see that we now have the 3 different processing types. Again, score will just do an outline around the object. Really, there's not much of a difference between score and cut. And you'll notice the only real difference that it shows between score and cut is that you can lower the focus on a cut. The only other difference really between the score and the cut is that setting that I was talking about before, where you're looking at the auto adjustment of the air assist. So technically when you're scoring, you're engraving, so it's going to have a lower value for the air assist. And when you're cutting, it's using this cut value here, so the air assist will be on full blast. So that's really kind of the difference that I see of why you would want to use score versus cut. So again, you can change the power and the speed settings. You can change how many passes. And now this really comes in more into play for me when I'm doing a cut, because I particularly like to not, try to cut everything in one pass, depending on how thick the material is. Because if you try to cut everything with one pass, you're much more liable to char the material. So what I end up liking to do a lot is do multiple faster passes, but not as, as intense. So, I still might have the speed or the power up to 95 to 100, but instead of having the speed down at, 6, I might have the speed up at 30 or 40. But then I would do multiple passes. So, it takes a couple of different rounds to cut it. But the laser head is never sitting in one spot for too long, potentially burning the material. It would do a faster pass around everything. So that's just the way that I like to work. Other people might be different. All right. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about this lower the focus. And what this is really used for is, let's say I had, let's say I was engraving the top of this thing and then I wanted to cut it out. Well, while I'm engraving, I need the focus to be right up at the top so that when I'm engraving, not everything is too deep. But let's say that after I engraved, this particular piece of wood was 15 millimeters thick. Well, the focal point that I want for the cut might not necessarily be at the top anymore, but it might be somewhat halfway down the thickness of the material that I'm cutting on. So that's really where this cut comes into play, and I might want to lower the focus. And so what that does is when I turn it on, I can say, well, when I'm doing this cut pass, I want the laser head to lower a certain number of millimeters. Now, you can kind of play with how far you really need to move this, if at all, depending on the thickness of the material that you're working on. But that's essentially what this does, is it'll allow you to engrave up at the top, and then as soon as it goes into the cut, it'll lower the head down just so that it moves the focus of the laser deeper to get some deeper cuts in the material. Of course, you don't want to go too far with this because you don't want to intersect with the material, but this might help a little bit by just lowering that focus so that everything is easier to cut. Okay, so that's pretty much the setup for just the regular laser flat. Again, there's multiple modes in here. So the next mode would be laser cylindrical. And then in here, again, we have the user-defined material. Here you can set up whether you're using the roller. So these would be those roller cylinders on the bottom of the RA2 Pro, or you could be using the chuck, which is, those jaws that will hold on to your tumbler or your cup. So if you select on the roller, the only thing it wants from here is the distance to the very top of that tumbler. So when it's laying on its side, it would be from the highest point. And then when you're using the chuck, it'll ask you either the diameter of the object that you have inside of the chuck or the perimeter. So the perimeter would be the circumference. So you can use just a tape measure to measure the circumference of the cup, or you can select the diameter. Depending on which one you put, it'll auto-populate the other one. So you just have to know one of those values. And then you can use the distance from the laser head to the top of the object. And so really all of these settings are still identical to what we would do whether we were using laser cylindrical or laser flat. And that's really the same for all of these. What the setup is a little bit different, but what is inside of there is all the same. Now, the only other thing to keep in mind when using the cylindrical is you're no longer working in this where this is up and this is down, because the RA2 Pro is making everything sideways. So you're going to want to rotate this 90 degrees. So let's say I had the bottom of my cup over here and I have the top of my cup over here. And so this is the orientation you want to work with if you're using that RA2 and everything is set up correctly. Okay, so the way that you set this up is you put the pointer in the center of the cup where it is in your machine. So right now, if you were to see my cup, the bottom is over here and the top of the cup is over here. And this is exactly in the center. Now, this is a little bit too large, so I'm going to move this and make this 90 millimeters large or wide, and then I'll move that back to the center. And so, again, this is the middle of the cup here, and you can use the framing process to make sure everything is set up. But again, this will be the bottom. The pointer is directly in the center of the cup, and so when it goes to start burning, it's just going to turn the cup until it gets to here, and then it'll just burn it from the top all the way to the bottom. And that's kind of how you set up your rotary for the S1. Okay, so the next mode that we want to work with is the curve process. This is where you can engrave or cut onto slightly waved surfaces. Now, you're not going to be able to do very deep things or things that are very steep angled, but if you have shallow bowls and other things that are just slightly not flat, this is where you're going to be able to work with those. Now, there is instructions up here. You can click on View, and that will bring you to a website that kind of goes over some of this stuff where it shows, you don't want to go to an angle that is greater than 15 degrees. Also not good with, abrupt height changes or sharp corners. So it's more for like a slope surface or very slight elevation changes. Okay, so the way that you set this up is you're going to click on Curve Measure over here. And then just like we do with the 2-point, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to move that red laser pointer all the way up to the top left corner. So I'm going to do that right now. Just moved it up to a top left corner of the really shallow bowl that I'm working on now. And I'm going to hit Mark. And so that will lower the pointer until it touches the object. And then it'll do it again just to make sure that that calculation is correct. Then it will move the laser head all the way to the corner so it can reset the probe. And now you see this mark of the vertex 1 is green, so it has recorded that correctly. So now I'm going to move my laser to the bottom right corner of where I want it to measure from. And then click Mark. So again, it will measure that probe twice. And then after that's done, we click on Next. So that will record a lot of data points. And then you can change this number of rows or columns based on where you want it to measure. I found that especially since this is more of a gradual slope between these points, you don't really have to worry as much about adding extra data in here, but obviously you can add more rows or columns if you would like. And then you just click on Start Measure, and it will probe each and every one of these points based on this first point and this last point that you had set up in the previous step. Now, I won't bore you with this whole process, so I'll speed this up until this process is done. Okay, so once that completes, what you'll get is a 3D model that somewhat represents the area that you just measured. So you can see these are all the points that it was measuring while going through the entire process. So if you look in 3D view, I can somewhat kind of see the shape that I was just measuring. You can also turn off the grid if you just want to see the 3D model itself. Now you can adjust the smoothness or the tension between the dots. So as you see here, you know, if it comes to too much of an abrupt corner here and then moves over, you can adjust that smoothness to kind of smooth that whole thing out, which is kind of what this is doing here. And then the tension would just be like, almost like if you were pulling it tight, like if it was cloth, you can adjust the tension of how strong those points are for the transition between all the other points would be the tension. If you had anything that looked incorrect or it just looked like something was broken, you could also go in here and select a point and then measure that specific point again if you feel like there is an error somewhere in here. And so once you're happy with that, just click on Done, and then it'll give you a gray area that shows you the outside of what you're working with. So everything on this white section is where everything is going to engrave or burn or cut. So you just want to make sure that whatever you're working on is inside of this area. Now, once you click out of it, if you want to go back and see it again, you can click on this icon over here and it'll take you back to this window. Now, you don't see it in this particular map. If you look at this image will show you some areas where the angle at which it was measuring is too high. Now, if you try to engrave in those areas, you're more than likely going to hit the object with the laser head while you're burning it. So you want to make sure that whatever you're working on doesn't have any engravings or work inside of those highlighted areas. It needs to be more like this one where everything is nice and clean and I don't have any of those too extreme angles. And then the rest of the stuff would still be just like any of the other modes as far as the engraving or the cutting in these parameters here in the menu. Now, the last process in here is the conveyor feeder. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a conveyor feeder for this machine, but essentially all this is doing is it's giving you a much longer work area to work off of. So if you want, you can engrave on much longer. Again, this is up to 10 feet, and you would have to have the conveyor as well as the riser base for the S1 to use this. And also, I believe that this is not available in Europe due to some safety restrictions with the lasers. But essentially, instead of having something like the laser flat where you just have a small working area, you have a much longer workable area. Again, it'll use all the same parameters as all of the other ones. The conveyor accessory will just hold on to the piece that you are working on and move it while it's engraving so that it will stick out of the front and back of the machine, and you will be allowed to engrave on much larger pieces than you would just through the standard laser flat. And so that's really all that is. Okay, and then finally sending the job to the machine, and click on Process. You will see a preview of what is going to burn. You can come over here and you have some of those same tools to move the laser head if you'd like to. You can also frame from here. And then when you're ready, you just click on Start. It will send the files to the machine. It's sending them because I'm using Wi-Fi to hook up currently. And then after that's done, it just asks you to press the button on the front of the machine, and then you're ready to go. So that's really it. I know this was probably a long video to sit through, but hopefully you found some of this useful. Again, this one was specifically now for the xTool S1. I'm going to try to come out with videos for all of the other machines that I have, including the D1, the P2, and the F1. So if you want to see a video on those where I go over the specific things, I'm going to try to release those videos. But again, the first part of this video should be the same for all of the different machines. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more videos having to do with laser engravers, 3D printing, injection molding, and all things maker. Thanks again, and we will see you next time.